Hi, it's Alex. Let's look at another example of the Bible arcing method in Luke 14, verses 34 to 35. Jesus here says, "Salt is good, but if the salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Now, after we've read the passage that we've defined, we want to begin to look for the separate propositions, the separate verbal assertions to begin to break the passage down into its various propositions. So let's identify those first of all. First, we have a proposition here, salt is good. The comma helps us, as well as this key word that helps us see this is our first proposition. And then we see the word but, followed by another key word, if, which makes us look for then coming sometime later in the sentence. But if the salt has lost its taste, comma, then seems to be implied right here, how shall its saltiness be restored? So we have a proposition, if the salt has lost its taste, and then a second proposition, then how shall its saltiness be restored? Question mark. And so we want to be looking for a question and answer, or maybe trying to decide whether this is a rhetorical question. Next proposition, it is of no use for the soil. It is of no use for the soil, or, key word here, for the manure pile. And this implication of a full verbal assertion, it's of no use either for the soil, it's of no use even for the manure pile. So we have a separate proposition here that we can define, and then a separate sentence as a proposition, it is thrown away. A further proposition, he who has ears to hear, and then a final one, let him hear. So I've written this out now according to its separate propositions so that we can begin to consider the relationship between each proposition here. Salt is good, but if the salt has lost its taste, then how shall the saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. So now the next thing I want to do is define these propositions. 34, this is A, B, C, and then verse 35 begins the next sentence. 35, A, B, C, D, E. I'm going to draw a line and then draw an arc over each proposition so that I can begin to graphically record each definition, each relationship between the propositions as we begin to go through this. And what I like to do is just start at the beginning and follow my eyes. So we see salt is good, but, and so we see probably an alternative relationship here, and yet because of the if, makes me wonder if there's something here that's being set into alternative with both of these propositions. So I'm going to go on before I define this alternate. If the salt has lost its taste, then we could say, how shall its saltiness be restored? So we can see that this then is implied right here. So we have a conditional if-then relationship. This is where I'm going to begin before I come back and define this alternative relationship between 34a and BC. Something else to be looking for here is what we noticed when we first read through it, how shall its saltiness be restored? Sometimes this can point us to a question and answer. Is there a question that's being asked here that's going to be answered down below? Or is this a rhetorical question? And if it is a rhetorical question, then we can restate it as a statement. Salt is good, but if the salt has lost its taste, then we could say its saltiness cannot be restored. We can rewrite this as a statement, and you can see that no meaning is lost. can see that no meaning is lost here. But when we write that out in this way, the same arcing still applies. If the salt has lost its taste, then its saltiness cannot be restored. So it does seem to make sense as a rhetorical statement. We'll have to be looking as we move down into verse 35 if there is an answer to this, which would keep this as a question and answer relationship rather than restating it as a rhetorical question. So let's move down to verse 35 then. And where my eye goes is right to this key word. It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. So we have another alternate relationship between A and B. And then we have a separate sentence in the ESV, it is thrown away. So we'll leave that for now and come back to it and resolve this final sentence, D and E, before going back to consider the relationship between each of the sentences. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. And this seems to be a construction that also exists as an if-then relationship, where Jesus is saying, if anyone has ears to hear, then let him hear. Sometimes I'll define this as, with the if-then, sometimes I'll just write conditional to remind myself that this is the condition of hearing. Whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. And of course we know when Jesus uses a construction like this, he's really emphasizing his point, listen closely. He's really wanting to re-emphasize what he has already said above and the importance of this as a final exhortation. Listen closely. Listen to what I've said. So now that we have these 4 arcs covering 4 sentences, we need to begin to consider the relationship between these sentences. And where my eye goes is in verse 35, A through C, to consider the relationship between A, B, and C. And there's probably some options. Is this a series? Is this an alternate? Is this an and that's implied here, or a but that's implied here? Or maybe even a therefore, a subordinate relationship of inference. It's of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile, therefore it is thrown away, which seems like it's a possibility, and yet AB seems to be coordinate with C, that both of these things are equally true. It's useless and it is thrown away. And in this kind of situation where there seems to be a tiebreaker, I would lean toward the simpler, what I see as the simpler coordinate relationship of alternative between those propositions, that they are equally weighted. And I think arcing them bears out, because even though the ESV chooses to make this 2 separate sentences, if you read the NASB or the NIV, you'll see they follow actually more closely the Greek construction, for those of you who are studying in Greek, where this sentence is not broken into 2 sentences. This is actually only separated by a semicolon in the NIV and the NASB here, not made into a separate sentence, because this is ABC is one sentence in the Greek. And so even our arcing here, even though in the ESV it's 2 sentences, our arcing reflects that same flow of the author's thought. So then, after we've arced that, we have these 3 arcs now to consider. What is the relationship between them? This seems to be a summary, a statement emphasizing what Jesus has said before. So then my eye goes to this relationship right here. What is the relationship between these 2 arcs, verse 34 going into verse 35? And again, we need to ask the question, is this a question and answer relationship? Is 35 an answer to the question stated in verse 34? I don't think so. As I read through this, this idea that this is a rhetorical question seems to stand. And then this seems to have equal weight in verse 34 to what Jesus is saying here in verse 35. Could it be a ground? Salt is good, but if the salt has lost its taste, its saltiness cannot be restored. For it is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. That seems to be forcing meaning on here. I think the simplest and most straightforward meaning is that of a coordinate relationship, an and that exists right here. Salt is good, but if the salt has lost its taste, its saltiness cannot be restored, and it is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. So I'm going to stick with this relationship of series and draw one arc over the top, and then consider the relationship between this 34 ABC and 35 ABC to this final seeming statement of emphasis here in D and E. And it seems connected, this seems connected as we read the passage, not only to what's gone previous here, but to what Jesus has said up above in chapter 14, verses 25 to 33 about discipleship. That those who are his audience, they're listening to the difference of saltiness in the life of a disciple. And this is where arcing forces us to deal with the wider context in which we find the verses we're dealing with, even if it's outside the scope of the particular passage that we're actually arcing, because we can see a connected flow of thought to what's gone above that's led to these statements and then is summarized or emphasized in this final statement. And even though Jesus is using a similar analogy to what he uses, for instance, in Matthew 5, what's recorded there in the Sermon on the Mount, where he simply states identity. You are the salt of the earth. He's using a similar analogy, and yet he's using it in a slightly different way here as Luke presents it to reinforce what he has already said above in regard to discipleship. The word then that comes to mind as I consider this hinge right here, this relationship, is therefore. Therefore, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. And so I'm going to mark this as an inference and draw one arc over the top. And this is how I would arc Luke 14:34 to 35.